There's a particular flavor of loneliness that masquerades as productivity. It hides inside laughter, not the kind that wells up from somewhere true, but the rehearsed kind, the kind you've practiced in the mirror. It wraps itself in busy seasons and packed schedules and the half-truth, I'm just swamped right now. But underneath, persistent as a bruise, there's an ache that refuses to leave. This loneliness isn't about being physically alone in a room. It's something quieter and far more insidious. It's the shock of realizing that in a world of billions, no one truly sees you. Not the you behind the filter. If you stepped back from the world for a while, the machinery would keep turning. Most people wouldn't notice the absence until weeks had passed, or they stumbled across your empty chair by accident. If something extraordinary happened, or something terrible enough to shatter you, you wouldn't know whose shoulder to cry into. There's no emergency contact. There's no one on speed dial who's earned that position through knowing you. This silence builds brick by brick, slow enough that you don't hear it accumulating. It's not frantic or desperate. It's the quiet kind, the kind that settles into your bones and begins to rewire who you are. Eventually, it changes the landscape of your mind. The way you think about yourself shifts. The way you carry your body through doorways changes. Your entire internal map of what's possible gets redrawn. There's a common narrative about people without friends. They're cold, detached, fundamentally disinterested in human connection. But this story is almost always incomplete. The truth is far more complicated and in many ways more heartbreaking. Sometimes the opposite is precisely what's happening. Some people feel too much. They're students of rooms and dynamics. They register every hairline fracture in tone, every subtle shift in someone's energy, every smile that reaches the mouth but never quite finds the eyes. They've spent years reading between words, noticing what's unsaid. And after enough of these observations, after enough near connections that somehow never solidified, they begin to pull away. Not out of hatred for people, but because the closer they get, the more dangerous it feels. Connection begins to register as a threat. The science behind this is precise and sobering. Prolonged isolation doesn't just affect your emotions, it physically alters your brain. When you go too long without real social bonds, your mind starts interpreting that isolation as a danger signal, like a predator circling in the dark. The same neural regions that light up when you experience physical pain activate when you experience social rejection. Loneliness doesn't only wound the spirit, it wounds the body. Your heart rate becomes irregular. Your sleep grows thin and fragmented. Your mind starts scanning the environment obsessively for threats that may not exist. This isn't random. We evolved in tribes where being cast out literally meant death. The brain never forgot that equation. Now we live in a strange paradox. You can be digitally connected to thousands of people and still feel completely unseen. You can accumulate followers, likes, messages, all that validation, and it won't touch the real hunger. Because attention and connection are not the same thing. Likes are not intimacy. Knowing someone and being known by them occupy completely different universes. And this distinction, this subtle but fundamental difference between being known and being truly understood, is something that people without friends comprehend more deeply than almost anyone. This isolation rarely arrives suddenly. It doesn't happen because someone woke up one morning and declared independence from humanity. It's far more gradual than that. It accumulates through small betrayals and large disappointments that layer on top of each other like sediment. You share something vulnerable and watch someone laugh. You tell a secret to someone you trusted and later discover it's become a weapon in someone else's hands. You attempt honesty and get labeled as too much or too intense or weird. After enough of these small deaths, your brain learns its lesson. It's safer not to try. It's safer to keep your cards close. So you stop reaching out. You stop making the first move. You start rebranding your isolation as a preference. I'm just not a people person, you tell yourself. And at first, solitude does feel like relief. It gives you control. It gives you space to breathe without worrying about disappointing anyone. But this is where the trap closes. After enough time, solitude transforms from something healing into something that haunts you. Because humans aren't designed to thrive in complete isolation. Even the most introverted, independent person still carries a fundamental need to be witnessed, to be mirrored, to feel the presence of another conscious being who recognizes them as real. When years pass without this, something strange begins happening inside your mind. Your internal monologue grows louder. Your thoughts start repeating like a scratched record. You find yourself having entire conversations with yourself, not out loud, but endlessly in your head. You replay moments from friendships that ended. You revisit conversations from years ago, analyzing them from every possible angle, wondering if you said the wrong thing, if you were too much, not enough, too sensitive, not interesting. You ping-pong between self-blame and world blame, but mostly you land somewhere in the middle, in that murky place where it's neither your fault nor theirs, just the brutal complexity of human connection when something goes wrong and nobody knows how to fix it. There's a psychological principle called learned social helplessness that operates like a trap. It happens when you've reached out and been rejected so many times, tried to connect and failed so repeatedly that your brain eventually gives up the attempt altogether. It's not a conscious decision. It's more like an automatic response that your nervous system learns. Your mind starts associating reaching out with rejection. The pathway becomes so worn that even when you meet genuinely kind people later, open people, understanding people, your defenses stay locked. You tell yourself you're content being alone, but deep down, there's still that echo of yearning for just one person who understands without requiring explanation. And yet, the more intensely you want this, the more impossible it feels to find. Loneliness begins whispering to you, you're too much, you're not interesting enough. People have better things to do than invest time in you. And after hearing this voice in your own head long enough, you start believing it. You pre-reject yourself, thinking if you push people away first, you'll be in control of the loss. You isolate not from pride, but from a twisted form of self-protection. Here's what makes this so complex. Loneliness doesn't always announce itself. You won't necessarily see it walking down the street. Sometimes the people without friends are the ones smiling in the room. They're working steadily. They're creating things. They're posting photos that look like they're having a life worth living. But there are two realities stacked on top of each other. The one the world sees, bright and functional, and the one they feel in the quiet hours, when the mask comes off and they're alone with the weight of their own silence. They've constructed a version of themselves specifically designed to survive without connection. It's a fortress, well-maintained, but inside that fortress, something feels hollow. It's like watching your own life from behind glass, present but not truly participating. It's easy to judge from the outside, to label someone without friends as strange or cold or difficult. But if you listen to their actual story, I mean really listen, not just to the headlines, but to the specific moments, you often find something closer to quiet heartbreak. You find the places where they gave too much of themselves to people who weren't generous in return. You find the moments when they opened their hands and received nothing but disappearance. Over time, all these small wounds accumulate and reshape the entire identity. They learn to associate intimacy with danger. They learn to link vulnerability with regret. And so they build a life that doesn't require these dangerous emotions. But this adaptation comes at a cost so high it barely gets talked about. Without genuine friendship, your world becomes progressively smaller. Your emotions bounce around in the chamber of your own mind with no one to soften them, to provide another perspective, to challenge a thought that's taken root and is strangling you. Psychologists have documented this. Prolonged social isolation actually reduces empathy. Not because isolated people stop caring, it's the opposite. It's because emotional exchange requires practice. Like any muscle, when it's unused, it atrophies.
So, people who've lived alone for extended periods sometimes experience a kind of emotional numbness that wasn't chosen but arrived as a consequence, a protective adaptation of the brain trying to shield itself from the pain of unmet connection. And yet, paradoxically, the people most starved of connection often become the ones who crave it most deeply. They don't want small talk. They don't want entertainment-based friendships. They think about connection more profoundly than most. They analyze it. They romanticize it. They've spent so long without it that they notice and treasure the smallest moments of authentic exchange, a real laugh, an honest conversation, a silence that doesn't feel empty. But here's the tragic part. When you've been isolated long enough, your behavior starts working against you. You become hypervigilant to social cues. You read subtext into every text message. You assume disinterest where none exists. You see distance in a delayed response that might just be someone being busy. You construct entire narratives from fragments, a pause, a word choice, a tone shift, and convince yourself the story is true. Your brain, having been trained by rejection to expect more rejection, starts scanning for it everywhere. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. You become cautious, people sense that caution and interpret it as coldness, they assume you're in distress, so they pull back, and the loneliness you were terrified of gets confirmed. It's not your fault. It's how the mind evolved to protect itself. But knowing that doesn't make it less damaging.
One of the most fascinating discoveries about loneliness is how it distorts your relationship with time itself. When you're not sharing moments with other people, time behaves differently. It moves slower. Minutes expand, hours feel heavier, days start bleeding into one another until weekends and weekdays feel identical. Holidays lose their shape, because holidays only matter when they're shared. Without someone to say, "Do you remember when?" to, without a witness to your experiences, time becomes a different substance entirely. Psychologists have found that loneliness literally alters how the brain perceives temporal flow. You're not imagining it. Minutes really do feel longer. But here's the paradox within this. Within that same silence and stillness, something beautiful can occasionally emerge. Solitude, when it's approached consciously and deliberately rather than imposed by circumstance, can be genuinely transformative. History is full of examples. The most self-aware people, the most creatively brilliant individuals, the most emotionally intelligent people on record, many of them spent extended periods in solitude. The critical difference is this: chosen solitude heals. Forced solitude hardens. One reconnects you with yourself. The other convinces you that you don't deserve connection with anyone else. For people without friends, it's often unclear which category they're in. They might tell you, "I'm just not a people person," or "I actually prefer being alone." But if you listen closely, underneath these statements, there's usually a quieter truth. They miss a very specific kind of laughter, the kind that happens only when you're with someone who truly gets you, someone you don't have to edit yourself for, someone whose silence feels warm instead of isolating. They forget sometimes that friendship is fundamentally a mirror. It shows you aspects of yourself that become visible only in reflection. Without that mirror, without that witness, it's harder to know if you're growing or stagnating. You can't become yourself alone, because selfhood isn't constructed in isolation, it's constructed through relationship. When that reflection is absent, you start to feel unreal, like you're moving through the world as a ghost, present but not quite existing. That's the specific pain that lonely people know, not just the pain of loneliness itself, but the pain of invisibility, the pain of existing without being witnessed by anyone. But underneath all this pain, something unexpected often lives: profound empathy. Because people who've known the particular sting of being unseen tend to see others with unusual clarity. They notice when someone is on the periphery. They're often the quiet ones who check in, who remember details others forgot, who understand without being told that being overlooked is one of the deepest kinds of hurt. And maybe this is the strangest paradox of isolated loneliness, that the people who have no friends often make the best possible friends, if only someone took the time to notice them first. Eventually, something shifts. It usually happens quietly, without fanfare. Someone who's lived too long in loneliness begins to recognize a truth. Waiting to be discovered isn't a strategy. It's a form of surrender, and not the healthy kind. And in that moment, healing can begin. Not with finding the perfect person, but with becoming reacquainted with who you were before the silence settled in. Because real friendship, the kind worth having, can only grow where self-trust already exists. If you don't believe your own voice matters, you'll keep it locked away. If you're convinced your needs are a burden, you'll carry them alone forever. And so the cycle continues. Unseen, unheard, the truest parts of yourself going unexpressed. Many people without friends live in the long shadow of old experiences. There are usually specific moments, sometimes from childhood, sometimes from recent years, when they felt too different, too sensitive, too introspective for the people around them. Maybe they were the kids who sat alone drawing while others played aggressive games. Maybe they were kind, but not loud enough to be noticed. Maybe they cared about things that nobody else seemed to care about. Over time, they started wearing this difference like armor, pretending it didn't sting, telling themselves they preferred to stand apart. But difference itself isn't the problem. The problem is the meaning we attach to it. When you grow up feeling misunderstood or left out, a dangerous narrative can take root. Something about you must be fundamentally wrong, and so you begin editing yourself down. You say less, you feel less, you expect less. You become a smaller version of yourself, and eventually you become a version that doesn't fit anywhere, not even with the people who might have loved the real, unedited you.
The psychology underlying all of this is deeply human. We're wired at a neurological level to belong, to tribes, to groups, to someone. It's not a preference or personality type, it's ancient survival software. But when belonging feels dangerous, when every attempt to connect leads to pain, the brain learns avoidance as a survival strategy. Avoidance becomes a safety mechanism, and safety, paradoxically, becomes loneliness. This is why so many isolated people appear outwardly calm. Their nervous system has learned to predict rejection before it arrives, to protect them by keeping them small. They exist in a state of constant self-management, perpetually trying to avoid being too visible, too much, too anything. But what they often don't realize is that this very strategy makes them more invisible, not just to others, but to themselves. It's like dimming your own light to avoid being seen by the wrong people, only to discover you've made yourself so dim that you can't attract the right people either. Psychologists talk about social self-concept, the way you see yourself through what you imagine are the eyes of others. When someone has spent years being ignored or excluded, that internal mirror becomes warped. They start assuming that everyone will see them the same way the others did. And even when someone finally looks at them with genuine kindness, they question it. They think the person is just being polite. They doubt the sincerity because trust has been broken too many times. But here's where hope enters. The human mind can learn connection again. It's not permanent. It's not destiny. Just as physical strength can return to an atrophied muscle through gradual exercise, social trust can rebuild itself through small, intentional acts of courage. It begins with seemingly tiny gestures, smiling back when someone makes eye contact instead of looking away, answering a message without overthinking it for 3 hours, saying yes to something that frightens you. It's not about forcing confidence overnight. It's about slowly allowing life to touch you again, one interaction at a time. Because real friendship doesn't emerge from perfection. It emerges from presence, the willingness to show up as you actually are, imperfections and all. What often goes unnoticed is that people who've experienced extended loneliness usually possess remarkable emotional depth. They don't just think, they think deeply. They observe quietly. They've spent years studying human behavior from the outside, watching how people work. So they often understand things that more socially integrated people miss entirely. They can detect sincerity from a distance. They feel shifts in energy before anyone speaks. They can tell when someone is being authentic versus when they're performing kindness. Because of this, surface-level friendships rarely satisfy them. They crave depth, but they also fear it.
So they build what you might call walls with windows, barriers that allow them to see without being fully seen. They want connection, but only on their terms, with guarantees of safety and consistency and warmth. And honestly, these aren't unreasonable desires. They're simply human. But there's another truth that needs saying. Friendship requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels absolutely terrifying when you've spent years building protective structures. You can't form real bonds without emotional exposure. And when you've been hurt before, exposure feels like walking barefoot through broken glass. So many people avoid it entirely. They tell themselves they're fine alone, but that's rarely the full truth. They're usually just exhausted from being the only one who tries, from reaching out only to have their hands slapped away. Yet here's the paradox. The moment you stop trying altogether, you confirm the very fear that made you lonely. You prove your own isolation right. And that's how the psychology of loneliness sustains itself. Not because connection is impossible, but because the mind becomes too afraid to risk the unknown. But imagine a different framework. What if connection wasn't about being impressive? What if it was simply about being honest? What if friendship wasn't something you had to earn through performance, but something you allowed? The truth is, the people who truly resonate with you won't demand a performance. They'll meet you exactly where you are right now. They'll sense the quiet in you not as absence, but as depth. Sometimes the first real step toward connection isn't meeting new people at all. It's grieving the old versions of yourself. The one who begged for crumbs of attention. The one who accepted scraps and called it care. The one who silenced their truth just to keep someone nearby. When you finally grieve those editions of yourself, something shifts internally. You stop attracting from a place of hunger and start attracting from wholeness. And that changes everything about how people respond to you. There's a strange liberation that arrives when you finally stop chasing people and start genuinely understanding yourself. You begin to see that being alone doesn't make you broken. It means you've been waiting for alignment. You start craving friendships that feel like breathing rather than performing, connections that bring peace into silence rather than disrupting it. Loneliness can become a teacher if you let it. It teaches you what kind of company your soul actually needs. It reveals what kind of energy you bring into the world. And it forces you to build an inner life so robust and real that when the right people eventually appear, you can meet them from a place of wholeness rather than desperation. Here's a quiet truth. People without friends often become their own best observers. They develop self-awareness that other people might never achieve. They spend time reflecting, questioning, growing in directions that don't get noticed. And that depth, born from solitude, but refined through observation, becomes the very thing that eventually draws the right kind of people. The kind of people who see not just who you are, but who you've become through everything you survived alone.
But healing from long-term isolation isn't quick. You can't rush it. You can't fake it. It requires gentle self-acceptance and learning to speak to yourself the way a true friend would. When your mind tells you no one cares about you, answer softly, "That's not true. I'm learning to care. I'm learning to matter." When your thoughts whisper, "You'll always be alone," respond with, "Not always. I'm still open to being found." Because your brain listens. It absorbs what you tell it. Neural pathways change through repetition, not through miracles. The more you affirm connection, the more your nervous system opens itself to recognizing it when it arrives. And it will arrive, because loneliness is not a permanent state. It's a season, a psychological winter that, when you allow yourself to feel the ache of it rather than run from it, eventually gives way to new warmth. The fundamental truth is this: not having friends doesn't make you less human. It just makes your story quieter. But quiet stories are still powerful. They can be filled with art and self-discovery and meaning that others never access. Some of the most brilliant thinkers, writers, and creators in history spent years in solitude before they found genuine belonging. And when they did find it, the friendship was deeper, wiser, more grounded because they had already learned to love their own company. So if you're reading this from a place of having no friends right now, please understand, you're not broken. You're not unworthy. You're simply in the middle of your becoming. The world hasn't forgotten you.
It's waiting for you to remember yourself. There will come a day, perhaps years from now, when you'll sit across from someone who looks at you and says, "I feel like I've known you forever." And in that moment, all the years you spent wondering what was wrong with you will suddenly make sense. You'll understand that solitude was never punishment. It was preparation. Every quiet night, every unanswered message, every invisible ache was sculpting you into the kind of person who could finally hold real connection. You'll stop craving the crowd and start cherishing the rare. You'll stop chasing attention and start recognizing genuine energy. And you'll finally know that friendship isn't about quantity. It's about recognition. It's when two people look at each other and silently think, "You too? I thought I was the only one." And maybe that's the truest kind of friendship there is. Not built from constant conversation, but from quiet understanding, from mutual gentleness, from two souls who've both known the particular sting of loneliness and decided together that they won't have to feel it alone again. Because real connection isn't about finding perfect people, it's about finding honest ones. The people who can sit with your silence without trying to fill it. The ones who laugh at your imperfections. The ones who see the complexity in you and think it's beautiful rather than exhausting. Those are the people worth waiting for. And when they arrive, you'll finally understand what it means to be truly seen. Not the version you created to survive, but the person you were always meant to be. Until then, move gently through your life. Speak kindly to yourself. Remember that even right now, even in this moment, you are worthy of being known. You are worthy of friendship. You are still part of humanity's invisible thread, connected always, even in your quietest moments. And maybe one day you'll meet another person who lived for years without friends. You'll see it in their eyes, that same stillness, that same depth of understanding. You'll smile, they'll smile. And in that moment, two silent worlds will finally find their bridge. Because loneliness is never the end of your story. It's only ever the place where your next chapter begins.